Isaacson, and I am proud to represent Highland Park Poetry with today's interview with poets Wilda Morris and Judith M.K. Kaufman, but in the interview I will call her Judy because we're friendly and informal. It's a pleasure to be with both of you, well-seasoned members of the poetry and literary community today. Judy, you are the you're the founder and the East on Central Literary Journal and editor-in-chief for 21 years? Mm-hmm. 21 years. And Wilda, you have been the past president of Illinois State Poetry Society and Poets and Patrons. Currently, you are the workshop chairperson for Poets and Patrons. You will both be featured poets on Saturday, August 12th at our next event at Trinity Episcopal Church in Highland Park at 425 Laurel Avenue from 4 to 6 p.m. We hope that you'll be able to join us. And we're going to have an introductory conversation with these two wonderful poets today. So we have about a half hour, and I'd like to start with the present and then go back to a little bit of the background for our viewers. Wilda, at this point in your writing career, how would you describe a most gratifying day of writing?
Well, that's an interesting question. I seem to write best when I go someplace like Panera, get a cup of coffee and sit down where the phone isn't going to ring, and can concentrate. Right now I'm working on a collection of poems inspired by books or articles that relate to science. So it would be gratifying to go to Panera, take a book or an article or two with me, and actually write something for this collection.
Wonderful. It's good to know. I always love to hear about the writers and poets' different processes of, like, I need silence. You need Panera orders going on in the background. So that's great. Judy, for you as well, what do you find to be a most satisfying achievement as you write?
It's interesting. Producing something, I think, is what I would say. I have days when I don't write at all, and many of my friends, write every day and set aside a certain time, and somehow I'm always interrupted anyway. So, but if I have come together with the substance of a poem, and then I put it away and come back to it the next day or in the next few days, generally, I'm not one of those people that looks at the same poem 40 times. I have some friends who do that. But although I will go back and look at old poems and change them now. Mm-hmm. So, but in general, yeah, I don't spend a lot it focused time. I let it just come out of me, and then later I will...
And then revisit it, let it evolve.
Yeah, and edit it. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. So just this very morning, in my word of the day, up came the word Hippocrene, which I did not know, and it refers to poetic or literary inspiration. So that's my next question to you. Mm-hmm. What is your theme? What inspires you?
Okay. I have a few subjects on which I probably focus most. The first being family. My inspiration for writing, though I didn't know it when I started writing, I never even thought about it. I didn't start writing till I was 50. And I thought, why am I suddenly writing something creative? I was always very good at, I used to be a copy editor for a law book publisher, so that was the kind of work I did. I was very much at term papers when I was in high school and college. And all of a sudden I'm writing something creative and I'm trying to figure out where it came from. And then it was like, duh. My mother, from the time I was a small child, would recite from memory so many different kinds of poems to me while she was cooking dinner, and I was a little girl. And to this day, I can still recite almost all of The Walrus and the Carpenter from memory.
But we won't do that today.
No, we won't. And a wonderful Hilaire Belloc, what was he, 18th century, 19th century? The story of a boy named Jim whose friends, who was taken to the zoo, but he never obeyed, and so he ran away and eventually became eaten by the lion. And the sense of humor in that poem
Sure.
was so important to me, because at the end, his mother, when she finds out what's happened to her son, says, well, he never did what he was told. And that was very much my mother's sense of humor.
So that stuck with you.
Yes, it
Interesting. Thank you. Wilda, how about you? Where do you find your inspiration?
Well, I should say that my grandmother recited a lot of poetry to me, so that was an important part of my background in poetry. But I have an interest in a lot of different things, and so I've written, my latest book is based mostly on family memories. The book before that was a response to Moby Dick by Melville.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, the project I'm working on now are poems, some serious and some humorous, responding to different articles or quotations out of articles that have to do with scientific topics.
Wonderful.
I have enough poems on nature. I could do a book on nature, so
Great.
we'll see what comes
So I'm
next.
going to ask you in a few minutes a little bit more about your books and your most current book. Now, on the topic of inspiration, I want to ask you first, Wilda. You've said what inspires you through your vast career in writing and all of the things you've been involved with. What do you find the best way to inspire others?
Well, I think it depends on who you want to inspire. But
Okay.
one of the
Fair.
things that I have done for, I don't know, 15 years maybe, I have a blog, and every month I post a poetry challenge. It's called Wilda Morris's Poetry Challenge,
Uh-huh.
and that inspires other poets to write poems to submit to my blog. And when I first started, I didn't have very many responses, but some of the poets who responded got enough encouragement that they've become fairly well known since then. So that's one way of inspiring
Excellent. Well,
others.
that's got to make you feel good to inspire people who have really kind of shown in the field. It's great.
Right. I've led a number of poetry workshops also, and given some people some encouragement in that regard.
Wonderful. Judy, how about you? How do you inspire others?
Well, what inspires me is family.
Mm-hmm.
And I have written many poems about my family. The one thing I'm not necessarily so great at that so many of my peers are is nature. Not something I know a lot about, interestingly. But I do love watching people. And my grandchildren have all written poetry at one time in their lives, and I've got 4 of them. You don't want me to mention my book yet that's coming up?
In just a minute.
So I am putting together my work about them. And I have written a book that was mostly stories, but there's some poetry in it that is the story of my parents meeting, getting married. They were the
Good. All right. Well, that's a perfect
funniest
segue, 'cause
people I could ever write about.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue because I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about your published book.
Okay.
So tell me about that book and your
And my
proposal with your
upcoming-
grandchildren. Then we're going to
Yes.
shift over to Wilma. She can
Okay.
show us her.
Yes.
Newest.
Unfortunately, I did not. I thought I had it with me and I didn't bring it, but I have a book called Caught Laughing, the Esther and Bernie Story. Esther and Bernie were my parents, and they were, especially my mom, two of the funniest people I ever knew. So I simply put together a collection of stories, family stories about them. And I had some pictures of them, starting with their high school graduation pictures and to their later years. Some of the poetry, I mean, I just like writing about those that I love. And so it was very humorous. For example, there's one story about my mom who looked very much like the therapist, Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Everybody would mistake her for that person. And she didn't like it because the woman was a sex therapist. So
she got asked some interesting questions on the street.
So when we went one time to dinner with my brother at a local diner, and everybody was whispering, "Oh, look who's here! Oh my gosh, it's Dr. Ruth!" And she did not like it. And when she sat down with my brother and told him that, he said, "Mom, you should know that Dr. Ruth escaped the Holocaust, was a soldier in the Israeli army, and all of these things about her, and all of a sudden, my mother was welcoming being
that's
confused
funny.
with her."
That's funny. That's good. She raised her credibility.
Right,
That's good.
right.
That's
So
good.
I find that family
Good.
is a source of a great deal
So
of
then
my writing.
tell us briefly, you touched, because then I want to have
Yeah.
Will to tell about her books as well.
What's coming up?
What's coming up.
Okay. I have been collecting poetry about my grandchildren since I started writing poetry. And I am hopefully going to get that together. I'm retiring as East End Central's editor-in-chief after this year. And my goal is to get this book done. It will be.
I'll hold this up.
Yeah, this is East End Central.
This is East End
right,
Central.
which has been publishing for 21 years. I was one of the founding members. So I called my children, it started with my daughter. I called my daughter Cookie. And then her brother was born, and she heard me call him Cookie. And she said, "He can't be Cookie, I'm Cookie." I said, "Well, you can both be my cookies." So she thought about it. She was about 4 years old, and she said, "Okay, but I have to be chocolate chip. He's oatmeal raisin." And as it turns out, he's allergic to chocolate. So I gave each of my grandchildren a cookie name. And the book that I'm going to put together is called The Cookie Jar. And a dear friend of mine, who actually was the person who had the idea for East End Central in the first place, Sumner Gart, he is a visual artist, and he has painted the cover picture, which is of a cookie jar with 4 children diving out of it.
Oh, that's wonderful. It sounds delicious.
Yeah, they are.
We'll look for.
They
I know.
are very
we'll look,
delicious.
We'll
That-
look forward to it.
Another word of my mother's, calling babies delicious.
There you go. So, Wilda, you were showing us before your newest book. It's Goat Hollow and Other Stories. Is that?
It's called At Goat Hollow.
Yeah, at Goat Hollow
other poems?
and other poems. I didn't mean stories. Right.
Originally,
So
I had
tell us a little bit about the contents of that.
Originally, I'd intended to call it The Unapproved Uncle because it's mostly poems about my uncle, who's pictured on the cover, Uncle Norman, who was kind of an unusual person. He wasn't totally approved of by our parents, but he and my Aunt Irene had no children of their own, and they liked to have nephews and nieces visit them. For a number of years, they lived on a little goat farm, so it was fun to go climb the tree and milk the goats and feed the chickens and so on. And these poems, I've been writing over a long period of time about this uncle and aunt. And people that go to the readings at Brood Awakening in Westmont told me, I love your Uncle Norman. So I felt like I had to gather the poems together and put them in a book and get them published. So that's my most recent book. And the one I wrote before that was Pequod Poems, Gamming with Moby Dick, which came out shortly before the pandemic, so most of the readings from that book got canceled. I did get to read at Arrowhead, where Melville wrote Moby Dick. So it's a very different approach because the Goat Hollow poems are poems from my childhood, basically, and my family.
So I think we may have time for each of you to read. If you want to read one of your poems. Wilda, if you want to start, since you just spoke about yours.
I need to find a poem here. Well, this poem
Okay.
is called Details, and it was written a number of years ago. It's a free verse poem. I don't want to memorize birth and death dates. I want to remember that Uncle Norman named his goats like children and taught me how to squeeze my fingers just the right way to squirt their milk into a bucket. That he let us climb high in the locust tree and got me to smile when I was crabby by calling me Billy Goat Gruff. That he played word games with us by lantern glow and showed us the lushness of the country sky at night. The stars that twinkled like his teasing eyes. That Aunt Irene loved wintergreen candy, Harvard beets, goat cheese, and bright red jello without fruit. Wore aprons over brightly patterned dresses. That she cared as much as Uncle Norman for the goats. Let Sis and me sit on her bed to dress her porcelain dolls. And when I brought her a sparkling rock, her eyes reflected the shine.
Beautiful. You made that experience very real. Thank you. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Judy?
Yeah, another subject that I have often written about is writing. I think I was so astounded with the idea that I was doing creative writing that it was always in my head. What do I think about this? So this is a poem that it's one of my earlier poems. It's called Alien Words. No longer pen to paper, but fingers to keys. The exercise of digits as they tap, 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 or pound, pound, pound. The brain is in the hand, I say. The one in my head has nothing to do with what ends up on the page. It is either serendipitous or disastrous. Is it really creativity or happenstance? Do I think profoundly or not at all? There is little artifice to my art. I am often startled at what I see. I do not say what I do is easy. Analogy to childbirth could be apt. But sometimes these offspring are genetic strangers whose DNA is from an alien being.
Love that. Really gets into our heads as as poets about how and why we do what we do.
Self-analysis.
Right. That's great. So Judy, I know that you've mentioned that you didn't start writing till a couple of years ago when you were 50.
A couple of years ago. Yes.
Years equals
Thank you.
decades.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. So at that time, what was the best advice that you ever received as a poet?
Wow. That's a hard one. The best advice I got, I think is not to focus on, hey, I'm creating something, but just to allow the thoughts to come out and then pick and choose what works and what doesn't. I would say that would be it.
Great. It's good sound advice. Wilda, how about you?
Well, there are two. I think one is the same, basically, as what Judy said, is to write from your heart and let it come out without self-editing while you're writing. Do the editing later. And the other advice I got more recently is write for the book. So if you really want to publish a book, see what poems you have that gather under a particular theme, and then have that theme in mind when you sit down to write. And not everything you write will go in that book or fit the theme, but at least it keeps your mind on that book so that you might be making progress toward a book to be published.
So with that knowledge of what was given to you and you've practiced, if when you come across aspiring poets now, for you, whether it's on your blog or Judy, for when you are, guiding people with East on Central and the work, what of what you just said, and some of it may repeat, but what do you try to impart to those trying to learn from you?
Well, I think basically what I said, write what's in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And let it come out. And I think it's good to get feedback because sometimes you think you've expressed something fairly clearly and it's very clear to you, but it's not necessarily clear to someone else who would read it or hear it. Like one of my friends many years ago, when marijuana was called grass, he had a poem with the word grass, and he was very clear he meant the grass in the yard, that kind of grass, but it wasn't clear to people who were hearing the poems. And if somebody hadn't given
It wasn't
him
clear to the high audience.
somebody asked the question about which kind of grass are you talking about?
Now,
I think-
now it's not grass, it's gummies.
we all need some feedback sometimes to know how our poetry is coming across to someone else, whether we're getting the idea across that we're trying to communicate.
Absolutely. That's
So
great.
having
Thank
a group that you can get feedback from is very important.
you. Yep. Absolutely. That's great. Judy, how about you? How do
On
you?
that subject, I've had a lot of opportunity to encourage younger people in high school and in their 20s, because as editor of East on Central, I'm always trying to get a little more youth into our journal. And I know that I tend to give them very specific advice about poems when I see them, and also try to make them expand their thought process. I think that is probably the major thing for me. Is I think when a young person starts writing, they're so focused on whatever is in their own heart, or what's bothering them in the moment, and I try to get them to expand their whole experience.
Beautiful. So, Wilda, who's your favorite poet that you like to read?
Well, it's hard to name just one. I think Liesl Mueller, maybe, if I had to pick just one.
You can
She
pick
was in
two.
Illinois.
I'll let you pick two. Do you have a second?
Well, I don't know. Picking a second one's even harder than picking a first
Okay,
one.
that's
maybe.
fine. It seemed like maybe if you were having a hard time choosing, I wasn't going to hold you to just that one. That's
For
good.
a contemporary young poet, Jose Oliveira, who wrote Citizen Illegal,
Uh-huh.
the Mexican-American poet in Chicago, is one that I really like.
Great. Good to know. Judy?
I have an attachment to Edna St. Vincent Millay. I have actually recently read, written my own piece of prose about the influence of Renaissance, her huge work, when I read it as I think a senior in high school. She touched something in me that just set off my thoughts about my religion, about life and the hereafter, that I just think that's one of the most amazing poems ever.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank both of you very much for this time. It's been enlightening, it's been inspiring, and you may have motivated me to sit down and actually write this evening. So,
Well, good.
I do want to remind our audience to please join us on Saturday, August 12th, Highland Park Poetry. We will be at Trinity Episcopal Church at 425 Laurel Avenue from 4 to 6 p.m. And we look forward to having you join us. Wilda will read more of her poems, I assume from your new publication and some maybe from previous publications. Mm-hmm. And Judy, I think same for you. We're going to hear more about Judy's family.
No question.
So, and maybe a few other topics.
Yes.
So I thank you both very, very much for joining us this afternoon and enlightening our audience.
Well, thank you for having us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.